Happy Monday, everybody. Every week I look forward to doing this. It's one of my highlights in the Monday. So we're going to be doing the best of one, best of three meta review. The best of one will be covered from Diamond and above through Untapped, which is a third-party tracker, so that I can keep this informational and kind of remove my opinion. And then in best of three, we'll be talking about the standard challenge and the standard showcase that happened on Sunday. So we've got 14 decks to cover here, and we'll start things off with Azorius Omniscience, which was number 1 according to Untapped from Diamond to Mythic, and was the only deck in Tier 1. So it's not uncommon for a combo deck to start to take off, because over time, better cards, it finds the perfect cards, and it just slowly gets better over time, unless something comes into the meta that really disrupts it, right? And the natural predator to the combo strategy is counterspells, right? Is like Azorius Control. And we've seen kind of a lacking of Azorius Control on the meta. Now, there was and is a list that we'll cover this week that was from Worlds that's kind of breathing new interest into Azorius Control, because in best of three, it's a natural counter to Domain, but in best of one, it's also a counter to Azorius Omniscience. And if you look at the popularity of this deck, it has been on the rise. So it's not as popular as Mono Red, but it's still growing in popularity. So we talked about this one. It has last week. It has no changes since last week. So we're going to kind of assume that you already know this list, and I'll still go over the matchups, though, and what I've been using for the opening hand, the mulligan strategy, if you will. So this deck is favored against Esper Self-Bounce, and I think that's really, in Diamond and above, Esper Self-Bounce was quite a popular choice, and this is a nice counter to that. However, it is weak to mono-red aggro. So your opening hand, you're looking for Omniscience, because... So if you have the Omniscience in hand, then you don't have to just hit one in your graveyard. You also get the outs of hitting Refute or Chart a Course. So it allows you to more readily get it into the graveyard if you have it in your opening hand. And then you also can play a second copy of it. If you do get one into the graveyard that you bring back with a Boros Awakening, playing a second one out means that if they use instant speed interaction to destroy the Boros Awakening, then you're still okay because you have the second copy of the Omniscience, right? The other, Abuelo's Awakening is a nice one to have in your opening hand, because then you don't have to go dig for it. But then if you don't have either of those, the Afara's Dispersal and the Philology Archaeologist are going to be your best bets for digging into your Abuelo's Awakening, because they help you out against the toughest matchup, which is Mono Red. Number 2, according to Untapped, in Diamond and Mythic in Tier 2, is Rakdos Aggro. And there's no changes from week 1. So not even like 2 weeks ago, this was the list that was being run. Last week, we did see a change to 20 lands that was kind of running the Urbresk's Forge, which is also a different version, or an older version. Both are viable strategies. They kind of take turns being which one wins out during which week, right? So this one, this strategy in general, regardless of which version you're running, is favored against mono red aggro. And that's really the appeal to playing the Rakdos Aggro strategy, is to beat the mono-red aggro strategy, which is the most popular deck on the ladder. And you do that by not running any form of interaction, so it's a more linear strategy that wins a turn sooner. And your opening hand, you're looking for Turn Inside Out, Monstrous Rage, Heartfire Hero, and Slickshot Show-Off. Any of these cards that are necessary to hit your turn 3 combo through the Callous Sellsword Fling. And I'm going to go through these a little bit faster than I have in some weeks, because we are starting to see some repetition in best of one, which is not uncommon for this time of year. It is kind of cool, though, that we went from Azorius Control being the best of one deck into Mono Red Aggro being the best for, like, a little bit over 6 months. And then now we're switching over into a combo deck, right? So we're going from control to aggro to combo, which is like the three main deck archetypes, if you will, right? So I've been pretty entertained over the last year or so, just with what Swatsy's doing. Anyway, I do have a video on the different deck types if it's all new to you. From a game design perspective, though, they've been knocking it out the park. I know that there's always people complaining, but I think they've been doing a good job. So number 3 here was Boros Mice, also in tier 2. No changes from week 1, so the same list from 2 weeks ago. We didn't cover it last week because it's a less popular pick, so it needed to get its matches up in number before it would show up on the tracker. Because of that, there's a small sample size, but I do expect it to be a similar strategy to Boros Mice because it's practically the same list as Boros Mice, or sorry, Boros Auras, which is basically favored against mono red aggro and then not favored against Esper Self-Bounce and mono black midrange. So, the opening hand for this one, though, is the same as Boros Auras. You're looking for Manifold Mouse, Sheltered by Ghosts, and Heartfire Hero. And mono red aggro, which if I do change it from bronze to mythic, mono red aggro is number 1. So if you are in the lower ranks and you're maybe new to Magic, mono red is a great starting place because it's an easy deck to play. It's an impossibly hard deck to play perfectly, right? So aggro gets called brainless a lot, which I disagree with, because playing aggro, like, the lines are complicated if you go like to the top 1200 mythic kind of level. If you're just jamming out, playing on curve, then mono red's pretty straightforward. But yeah, I've used it to hit mythic. It's a fun one. Last season, I used the Azorius Omniscience to hit top 1200. Before that, I used the Rakdos Aggro. Like, I've used all of these strategies to hit mythic. They're all very viable options. Anyway, the mono red aggro, this one we do see some changes to this list. We see a Mountain and a Witchstalker Frenzy has been dropped to bring in 2 additional copies of the Soulstone Sanctuary. And we've seen this ranging from like 1 copy up to 3, so you kind of have to decide in your matchups. This is better for extending into the mid game. Worse off than if you're trying to go for the pure aggro strategy where you're like bumping up against other mono red decks, right? Then bringing in the Soulstone Sanctuaries is not going to be advantaged. But the more that you're coming up against like mono black, then the Soulstone Sanctuaries are nice to have. The lands really extend the threats and the ability to play around wraths of your opponent. So just keep that in mind. It's a little bit matchup dependent on whether or not you want to run the Soulstone Sanctuaries. So this deck is favored against all of the slow archetypes and best of 1. So Domain, which we saw a big spike in after Worlds. Azorius Control, which we've seen a rise in as well. Azorius Omniscience. This is one of the, if they're going to try to win on turn 4, then you try to win on turn 4 but have the play. And then it's also favored against Golgari Self-Mill, which was another archetype that saw an increase in popularity from Worlds. It's a coin flip against Esper Self-Bounce and mono black midrange, kind of depending on whether or not you have the play. It's a lot easier to deal with their removal if you're on the play. And then it is weak to Boros Auras and Mardu Aggro, which is basically, Mardu Aggro is Boros Auras, but with the fling. And the opening hand, you're looking for the Heartfire Hero, the Manifold Mouse, the Hired Claw, and the Monstrous Rage. Number 5, according to the tracker, in Tier 2 is Boros Auras. This is another one that has decreased a little bit in popularity from where it was. Once upon a time, it was the number 1 deck, but it's dropped a little bit because of its bad matchup against Esper Self-Bounce and the Nowhere to Run. As far as the list goes, we see that this one, if we compare it to the 2 weeks ago, it's dropped 2 Thran Portals to bring in a Mountain and a Plains. So really not a dramatic change, right? So this is a lot of these archetypes have been relatively figured out, right? So it's favored against mono red. That's really why you would choose to run the Boros Auras, as you're bumping into a lot of mono red on the ladder. It's a coin flip against Domain. This strategy is a little bit weak to sweepers, so you have to kind of race the Sunfall and hope that they don't hit the temporary lockdown. And then it is weak to Esper Self-Bounce and mono black midrange because of getting 2-for-1 when you go to play an aura on one of your creatures. You kind of have to have the Shard Mage's Rescue and then hope that they don't have the Nowhere to Run. Because the Nowhere to Run just negates this card from being useful, right? The opening hand is Sheltered by Ghosts and the Heartfire Hero. And, Manifold Mouse is okay, but really you're leaning into the Voltron. You really want, ideally, Optimistic Scavenger is okay too. But Heartfire Hero into Sheltered by Ghosts is chef's kiss. All right, number 6, according to the tracker, is Orzhov Bats, sometimes called the Raise the Pass combo deck. No changes from last week when we talked about it. It's still sitting in tier 2. It's a small sample size for the matchup data as well. You're not really playing this deck because you're trying to counter something specifically on the meta. You're more playing it because it's a fun deck to play. And number 7, according to the tracker, is Mono Red Goblins. For the fellow Goblin fans out there, I would still hold off on crafting this if you are short on wild cards. I would also be wary of anybody who claims that certain cards are definitely not viable. We're seeing a lot of different variations in the Mono Red Goblin builds, and some lists are ditching Krenko entirely and then capping off at Breaches and Squee. Others are dropping the Squee and bringing in the Draconautics Engineer to... If you're playing the Krenko, you're going to play the Draconautics Engineer. The question is whether or not you play 2 copies or if you play 4. If you're dropping Krenko from the list and you're going for the more aggro Goblins build, which I don't know why you would, because the point of this deck is to go wide. It's going to be slower than Mono Red. So if you're going to build an alternative version to Mono Red that is a turn slower, it's just never going to be a competitive deck. Whereas if you go for the Krenko build, you're going to at least be a go wide strategy that punishes single point interaction in mono black, right? So if you're playing like the rock paper scissors game of the game design, I think the Krenko build makes more sense, and that's where I'm putting my money, is that the Krenko build is going to be what wins out in the long run. And then in that case, giving your Krenko haste so that it can immediately tap is a decent strategy. So if we compare this one to week 2, we do see a significant amount of change. So we've dropped 3 mountains, we've dropped 2 Cavern of Souls to bring in... we also dropped the Dropkick Bomber, which is a Lord. The Lords are less important if you're running Krenko. This one's not running Impact Trimmers, some to explore that as well. But this one is dropping a Lightning Strike, which I don't like the Lightning Strike personally. If you're doing more of the aggro build, then I guess it could be okay. And then it's also dropping Squee. And on the 1-drops, we're dropping the Cacophony Scamp. So Cacophony Scamp's a tricky one because it attacks relatively well and kind of enables your Seer Slicer Goblin. So I personally liked the Cacophony Scamp, but I think the Grease Wrench Goblin might be better because of the late game kind of dig for Krenko. Again, time will tell. And this one's running the 4 copies of the Fanatical Firebrand. Again, this one, I don't know if this one's better than the Cacophony Scamp. We'll see. I'm not convinced yet. But this one's bringing in Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which we saw in Foundations before we got the Aetherdrift Goblin cards that are breathing more interest into this archetype, right? So Agatha's Soul Cauldron, if you have a Krenko in the graveyard, then you can put one of a +1/+1 counter on it and give it Krenko's ability, and that's really why you've got the Agatha's Soul Cauldron in here. It also gives you a little bit of graveyard hate if you're up against Azorius Omniscience, which can't hurt. And then we've also got the 3 Tree City. That one's one that I've played this one in Commander in Mono Red Goblins. I haven't tried it out in Best of 1, but I can kind of see the logic behind it, because you do need more lands as you go up to 4 copies, right? I have my doubts that this will actually stay throughout the weeks, though. We've also got 2 additional copies of the Burst Lightning, and this I think largely has to do with improving the matchup against Mono Red and Rakdos Aggro, where if you have an answer for the Slickshot Show Off or the Manifold Mouse, then you're less likely to just get completely steamrolled by the more aggressive deck. So I like a little bit of interaction. I've also seen Torch the Tower being played. This one's leaning fully into the Amonkhet Raceway, also giving additional ways of hitting Krenko with haste. And then, like I mentioned, we're running the 2 additional copies of the Draconautics Engineer. So the matchup data for this varies widely depending on which list you are talking about. But in general, talking about specifically the Krenko build in the majority, it's favored against mono black midrange because of going wide. It's a coin flip against Domain and Esper Self-Bounce. Go wide strategies like Boros Convoke and whatnot, right, can struggle against the sweepers in Domain. And then It's weak against mono red aggro because it's just it's a bit slower. It doesn't curve out as well as mono red. So the opening hand, though, you're looking for Howl Squad Heavy, Seer Slicer Goblin, and then the Runvelt Hordemaster, which has been the more superior lord than compared to the Dropkick Bomber. Because of being able to give you the dig off of your tokens that you're just like sending in with the Seer Slicer Goblin. So like, yeah, if you haven't played this deck before, if you're attacking, you get the raid, it just replaces itself, right? So sometimes you can use that as like a free way to just dig with the Runeville Hordemaster. And then after that, you're looking for your 1-drops, right? You're looking for any of your 1-drop bodies. Fanatical Firebrand has been performing the best, which is, I think, why we see it over the Cacophony Scamp as kind of your turn 1 option. Part of that is being able to trade off with annoying problems, right? If they're going to go for putting a Sheltered by Ghosts on something, then you can pop it with the Firebrand, which is something that the Scamp can't do at instant speed. So, pros and cons to everything, as always. All right, and then yesterday, if you followed the meta breakers that I do on Sundays, I was talking about an Azorius Control list that was quite a bit more similar to what we saw at the beginning of Foundations, where they were trying to explore kind of the alternatives to like what we could do post-rotation with Memory Deluge, right? So this one is number 8 according to the tracker, and also in Tier 2, and this is the version that was played in Worlds, right? I think it was Arne brought Azorius Control. I don't remember exactly, but one of your classic pros was bringing Azorius Control because it's a really good option against Domain, right? It's going to struggle a little bit against the mono red builds and the Gruul Prowess builds and the aggro in the meta and in best of 3, but the Azorius Control does just completely dunk on some strategies, right? And having things like No More Lies and Negate definitely is a decent option against the Azorius Omniscience deck. This Thursday, I will be showcasing my mono blue flash build that also dunks on Azorius Omniscience if you're struggling against that matchup. It's far from broken, so I don't think we'll see any bans or anything like that. So if you like the Azorius Omniscience, though, and I've been really enjoying it, like, get your combo reps in before the meta shifts and then it's no good anymore, right? Such is magic. So this one's favored against Domain. It's favored against mono black mid-range because you have like 0 creatures that you really care about for the removal. And so like it punishes that half the deck in mono black mid-range is removal. And similarly, but a little bit less so. So it's a coin flip with Esper Self-Bounce, largely for the same reason, but the Esper Self-Bounce has a little bit more of the go long with the Storm Chaser's talent loop. And then it's weak to mono red aggro. This deck can struggle a little bit against the early pressure of mono red, unless you hit the Get Lost and Temporary Lockdown, right? So the opening hand for this one, you're looking for Ride's End, No More Lies, and Stock Up. And speaking of Stock Up really quickly, there have been I've seen some Azorius Omniscience lists running Stock Up, so we'll see in the future if that eventually makes it into the list. It doesn't put anything into your graveyard, so I like Stock Up way more in Azorius Control than I do in Azorius Omniscience. I just want you to be aware of it. All right, and now for best of 3. So we'll talk about Friday and Saturday's tournaments, and then we'll talk about the Standard Showcase, which is a bigger, more special tournament on Magic the Gathering Online on Sunday. So first place on February 28th was taken down by Bant Control by the Slickshot Gang, and this is a new archetype. Bant Control's been around for a while, so it's not really a new archetype, but it's new to the Aetherdrift meta, right? So we're ditching all of the green. We're ditching all of the not all of the green. We do have Obstinate Baloth in the sideboard, which I guess is what makes this Bant Control. But anyway, it's Domain minus the green. So we're getting rid of the Overlord of the Hauntwoods, and we're bringing in some more blue so that we can play the 3 steps ahead in the No More Lies, which the counter spells give you. Like, Azorius Control is a natural counter to Domain, right? So this is to take advantage of the fact that everybody was playing Domain after Worlds, right? So everyone saw number 1 on Worlds, and they decided, okay, I'm going to play Domain. And so then Bant Control comes in and is like, okay, well, we're basically Domain, except for we're going to win the Domain matchup because we're mainboarding Jace and we can counterspell the important cards of our opponent's strategy, right? So the best of 3 sideboard is also relatively similar to what we see. So you don't need to be able to cast the Obstinate Bowel if you're just playing this, if they are playing something like the Hopeless Nightmare. Same with the Wiltleaf Liege, although that one allows you to actually cast it. Tishana's Tidebinder is really good for the Azorius Omniscience deck, for the Dimir Self-Bounce deck, anything that has interesting triggered or activated abilities where you can stick something on the board. Rest in Peace is good for Graveyard Hate, either the Golgari Self-Mill that we've seen growing in popularity, or Azorius Omniscience, or Azorius Oculus, or its counterpart Jeskai Oculus that we also saw a spike in after Worlds. Jace the Perfected Mind, we can drop this up to 4 if we're up against Domain. Beza if we're up against Aggro. Negate if we're up against Domain, other control decks. And then Authority of the Consuls if we're getting squished by Mono Red. And then number 2 was Domain. Domain Overlords. I guess there's technically an Atraxa build that's more of the old school Domain, and so it's nice to be able to denote which one you're talking about. They're very similar in strategy, though. This one also sometimes called the 4-color Zur deck, but we'll go with Domain Overlords because that's what they called it in the Pro Tour. This one was by Pico MTG, and we took down 2nd place on February 28th. And if we compare this one to the Worlds list, we can see that they kind of went back to the more typical build on the lands. First place was hedging that there was going to be no Azorius Control and no Bant Control, so they dropped the Cavern of Souls. But I think, the Cavern of Souls is nice to have as an option if you are actually playing against a non-Pro Tour meta. So yeah, we brought back we dropped the Hedge Maze, the 2 Shadowy Backstreets, the Flood Farm Verge, and we also brought the Overlord of the Mistmoors down 1. We took out 1 copy of Beza, and we also dropped the 2 copies of the Day of Judgment. And what was nice about the spread on Day of Judgment, right, was that you had a Sweeper on Temporary Lockdown on 3, you had Day of Judgment on 4, and then you had Sunfall on 5, which made it very difficult for your opponent to figure out when to play around the Wraths. Which, I think the Pro Tour is probably a little bit more important for that sort of thing than just your casual tournament. But that is something to keep in mind, is that if you are running the Day of Judgments, it can be a little bit harder for your opponent to play around instead of anticipating you to just have a Sweeper on 3 and 5, right? So this one is instead running the additional Sunfall, which we kind of saw was a popular pick prior to Worlds. It's running an additional copy of Get Lost, and is running 2 copies of the Overlord of the Flood Pits. So this one gives you a little bit of card draw, can extend up against decks that are good at attacking your enchantments. In the mirror match, I'm not certain that it really gives you as much advantage as some other cards that we'll mention, like, Elish Norn and whatnot that we saw in Worlds. But as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we dropped Nissa Ascended Animus down to 1 copy, which is, I think, pretty standard to have the 1 Planeswalker instead of 2. It's good against any of the it's good against the mirror match, because like the Planeswalker dodges the Wraths while also being able to hate repeatedly on the enchantment. So anything that has artifact or enchantments that are interesting, as well as running Wraths, right? Any of the control matchups, basically, you're going to bring in Nissa. I guess now that we have the Bant Control and Azorius Control, Planeswalkers don't do well against counterspells, so take that with a grain of salt. Bring it in against the Sweepers. How about that? We've also got 1 less Tear Asunder, which is artifact and enchantment hate. We've got 1 less Stock Up. I think we're going to see Stock Up make its way into a lot of decks going forward. We'll see. Elish Norn was not being run in here. I kind of like it for the mirror match. I think Elish Norn, anticipating there to be a whole spike in Domain, I'd be pretty tempted to keep the Elish Norn. And then we also have 1 less Atraxa Grand Unifier. I'm actually still a little bit uncertain about which matchups you bring in the Atraxa Grand Unifier from the sideboard. So if you know, let me know in the comments below. I could always look it up, I guess. And then the Pop Hatch Formation is removed. That one gives you the flying hate and the enchantment hate. So that one's a decent Mirror Match as well, because it gets rid of Atraxa. You can also bring it in against like Azorius Oculus or Jeskai Oculus. And then we're also bringing in, let's see, third copy of Rest in Peace, which has become the standard. I still like 2, but I'm definitely in the minority here. Doppelgang for the Mirror Match, or any deck that's good at shutting down your enchantment strategy. Stonebrain, anything that's like a single point, if they have a Crux that you can remove and then they just lose, like, gives you a decent option against Azorius Omniscience. Elspeth's Smite for mono red, and 1 additional negate for control matchups. All right, on to the first set of Saturday's tournaments. We have Esper Self-Bounce by Ruby Exilia. Took down first place on March 1st, and if we compare this one to 2 weeks ago, because Esper Self-Bounce did not make it into the top 8 in the Pro Tour, I think everyone was just gunning for it, right? I don't think it's a bad strategy. I just think it was public enemy number 1, and so it was taken out of the tournament. Anyway, we see that they dropped a single copy of the Go for the Throat and dropped the 3 copies of the Spiteful Hexmage to bring in a Destroy Evil, 2 copies of Mockingbird in the main, and then the Bottomless Pool. And if you want the specific, I think most of those were listed in my sideboard guide in the community tab. The Destroy Evil, obviously, for enchantment hate, and the Rise in Domain. Bottomless Pool helps out against the aggro matchups by being able to have that bounce and interaction. And then the Spiteful Hexmage, I can't remember the matchups off the top of my head for that one, but you get some interesting enchantment interactions with your Optimistic Scavenger and your Nurturing Pixie, and it's sometimes included in some lists, sometimes not, right? The best of 3 sideboard, though, we've got 1 less Shrouded Shepherd, which is the sweeper. Give everything -1/-1. Then we've got the 1 less Spell Pierce and 1 less Momentum Breaker, and running the second copy of Sheltered by Ghosts. This one's good against the aggro matchups. Defiled Crypt is good against the mono black matchups. Anything that's like trying to kill your targets, being able to bring something back is particularly nice. Gives you kind of a little bit more late game, creating the 2/2s as well. And then Kaido in the sideboard. Again, Kaido, I talked about this a little bit during the Meta Breakers, I think. Kaido is better in the mid-range to control matchups, worse off in the aggro matchups. You're going to want to be siding Kaido out if you're up against Mono Red or Gruul Prowess, and then siding Kaido in if you're up against, like, Domain. Second place on March 1st was Bant Control by Misplaced Ginger, and we're going to skip that one because it was the same list in sideboard as the Domain or the Bant Control list that we talked about on Friday. And then similarly, first place on the second set of tournaments was Esper Self-Bounce by Alfredo Torres. We're going to skip that one. It was the same list in sideboard as the list that I just covered. This one, though, is a little bit different than what we saw in Worlds. So this was Mono Red Prowess by Mana Lachao, or Mono Red Aggro. And it took down second place on March 1st. And if we compare this one to Worlds, it is running 1 less copy of Screaming Nemesis and 1 less copy of Soulstone Sanctuary, and bringing in the 2 copies of the Mountain, right? And for the best of 1 deck, this was the reason why we saw the Soulstone Sanctuary sneaking up to 3 is because it was reflecting the World's deck, right? Personally, I think the 3 Soulstone Sanctuaries work better in best of 3 than they do in best of 1. Again, but that's why I use the tracker to remove my bias. The best of 3 sideboard here, we see 4 changes. So we dropped the 2 copies of the Ghost Vacuum and the 2 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy. And instead, we're running the 2 copies of Pyroclasm. This helps out against Mono White, Boros, Convoke, Gruul Prowess, Mono Red, just anything that has kind of like a small lower curve where the sweeper hits quite nicely. Furnace Punisher is a way to kind of bring in additional hate against all of the domain, right? So we've got 4 copies of Sunspine Links, but if that's not enough, you could also bring in the Furnace Punisher to really hate on any of the 3-color strategies. So it also works well against Esper Bounce. And then we've got fourth copy of Torch the Tower, and I like to bring these in, like especially on the draw. When say you win game 1, in game 2 when you're on the draw, you're gonna switch the pacing of this deck, especially against other aggro, by bringing in the Torch the Towers, right? So it's really good for the mirror match, Gruul prowess, that sort of thing. All right, and now to the one that I was the most excited about, which is the standard showcase on Magic the Gathering Online, which happened on March 2nd. So this first place was taken down by Esper Self-Bounce by CFTSOC3, and quite a different approach than what I've been used to seeing, right? So if we compare this one to the list that we already covered by Ruby Exilia, we can see that they dropped an Underground River, which is just the Painland, and dropped the Bottomless Pool, and dropped the 2 copies of the Mockingbird. But interestingly, they dropped the 4 copies of the Optimistic Scavenger. And if you're not leaning into the Spiteful Hexmage, maybe it works pretty well to drop the Optimistic Scavenger, right? Because a lot of times, like I've lost to it for sure, but like it's not the main card that you're losing to in this matchup, right? So definitely an interesting one to consider, right? Exploring. So they're bringing in the Preacher of the Schism. This is better against the aggro matchups where you're trying to slow them down, where the 2/4 Death Touch can kind of, make the Screaming Nemesis and whatnot like answerable. We've also got the Restless Reef and 2 copies of the Overlord of the Baelmerk. We've seen this one before in the Esper Self-Bounce lists. I like the Overlord of the Baelmerk. It's an enchantment. It has the synergies. We're also running a second copy of the Momentum Breaker, and then bringing in the 2 copies of Stock Up. And again, like I said, this card is we're starting to see it in quite a bit more popularity throughout Best of 3, which will then make its way down into Best of 1. So the Best of 3 sideboard also got a rework here pretty decently. It's the same exact sideboard as the one that we covered in the last week of Foundations, so week 12 of Foundations. This is the same sideboard. But if we compare it to Ruby Exilia's, we can see that they dropped a Destroy Evil, they dropped the Grim Baubles, they dropped the 2 Sheltered by Ghosts, and the No More Lies, and Kaido, Bane of Nightmares, and the Shrouded Shepherd, to bring in a single copy of the Preacher of the Schism. This was a classic sideboard card when there was kind of when Gruul Prowess was kind of the deck instead of Domain to sideboard against, right? We also have the 2 Ghost Vacuums for hate on Azorius Omniscience, Azorius Oculus, Jeskai Oculus, that sort of thing. We have the 2 copies of the Pest Control for the Go Wide Sweeper, for the Boros Convoke and the Mono White Tokens build. We've got 2 copies of the Break the Spell, and I think this was being explored at the end of Foundations as a way to answer the Zur deck. I'm not huge on destroying their enchantments 1 for 1 because they usually get advantage off of the Overlords already provide some form of advantage. So if you remove them 1 for 1, you're kind of falling behind in value. But anyway, Break the Spell was being explored as further enchantment hate. Temporary Lockdown for against the aggro matchups, and the 3 copies of Dreams of Steel and Oil was a way to get some artifact hate into the sideboard for cards like Urabrask's Forge and such, right? But yeah, giving you artifact and creature hate. All right, and we made it to the last one, which is Mono Red Aggro version 2 by Mega Venusaur. And if we compare this one to Mana Lachau's list from earlier in this episode, this was second place. We can see that they took out 5 mountains to bring in 4 copies of the Thornspire Verge and 1 Screaming Nemesis. And the sideboard, the only green card that we're playing is the Questing Druid, which is technically, I guess this makes it Gruul aggro and not mono red, but we've seen mono red where it was just the Questing Druid before, and I think it's fitting to call it a mono red strategy. So the best of 3 sideboard is dropping 2 copies of the Lithomantic Barrage, still keeping 2, but dropping it down from a full play set. Dropping 1 Torch the Tower, and dropping the Furnace Punisher and the Pyroclasms, to bring in 2 copies of the Obliterating Bolt. And this one was we were talking about Gruul Prowess in week 1 before the Pro Tour had like up to 4 copies of Obliterating Bolt in Gruul Prowess, because of like Sentinel, Haughty Jin, I guess, and like Azorius Oculus, Enduring Curiosity. Like there was a number of things that were 4 toughness that needed to be exiled, right? So the Obliterating Bolt was nice to have as an option. So this one having it in the sideboard instead of the main. And then the 4 copies of the Questing Druid. I've gotten this question before, so I'll just address it now. When do you want to bring in the Questing Druid, and when do you want to keep it in the side? I believe that you should bring in the Questing Druid against the mid-range and controlling matchups where you need treat it more like Seek the Beast than the actual creature side, where you need additional dig. So if they're able to kind of disrupt your strategy a little bit, then you can bring in the Questing Druid. Worse if you're trying to race a fellow aggro deck, in my opinion. So, as always, thank you so much to listening to my ramblings every week. I'm amazed that there are, a returning audience who likes to listen to me ramble about Magic the Gathering. It's really rewarding. I've really enjoyed getting to know all of y'all, and the community around Magic the Gathering has been amazing. Thank you everybody who's come over from YouTube to say hello on Twitch, even if it's just briefly to say hi. I always love to see people from YouTube. And thank you again to my YouTube members. I really appreciate it. Those who have also subscribed on Twitch, just anybody who can help me out monetarily. I'm doing this for like $3 an hour. So the money's not really great, and so any of the support that you guys can send my way makes it a little easier to do week after week, right? And I'm trying to give something back, right? So every week I'm doing 4 brews that you guys get to vote on that I then showcase as a video, and then tomorrow is the community deck tech. So don't forget, if you have a deck that you want to submit, if you're a YouTube member, you get priority. If you're not a YouTube member, you can still get my thoughts on a deck of yours, on a brew, anything like that. If you're because one of the things that I enjoy a lot about Magic is, you can always play the Azorius Omniscience deck and like grind up to Mythic top 1200 or whatever, but like it's also fun to just make decks and kind of play it a little bit more casually, right? Heaven forbid. Anyway, thank you once again for listening and bearing with my ramblings, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. I'll see you tomorrow for the community deck tech. Right now it's looking like a short episode. We've only got 2, and then Thursday will be the mono blue flash deck, and it was a lot of fun to make, a lot of fun to play. It was really good for getting the Your Go achievement as well. So if you're achievement hunting, look for the deck that I made on Thursday. And then Sunday, Meta Breakers as usual, and we'll kind of rinse and repeat. Community deck tech should be every 2 weeks going forward. That seems to be about what I can do in my schedule. And then I'm going to try to do a weekly gameplay video, but it's schedule dependent. So anyway, I've rambled long enough. Take care. Good luck on your RCQs and crushing the ladder, and I will see you all tomorrow.